What was your biggest motivation when things got tough?
Okay. I think what you want to do is, though, is start off with I'm interviewing.
Oh, that.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm interviewing Dwaine
Plaza.
about being a first-gen college student. It is October 18th, 2016. All right.
Good.
What would you say your biggest motivation was when things got tough?
Well, let's see, Carl. When things got tough, I think I would always harken back to, and again, this is going to sound kind of strange, but to my ancestors. So I never had anybody in my family who actually went on to do college before me. I only had a sister who was 1 year ahead of me, so that she didn't finish yet, so she was still in the process.
Right.
So for me, I'd harken back to thinking about my immigrant family, because we had just migrated to Canada. And I watched my parents. My parents worked really hard. And so that became, for me, a motivation that said, hey, these two people are making a huge sacrifice for you in all kinds of different ways to put you through school. And so that became, for me, the push to be successful at school or to be successful whatever I was doing.
Right.
And just sort of the idea that people who had come even before them were really instrumental in getting us, my grandparents, their ancestors, and so forth and so on. So it's not as if I'm doing this alone, but I'm doing this with a whole bunch of people, in a sense. I'm standing on their shoulders. Is what I'm
Right.
doing. I'm not doing this,
Support system.
That's right. They've all been there. Because of what they did, it's where I am today.
Right. So you said you were talking about your ancestors, how you guys migrated.
Yeah.
So do you remember a time where you felt like you were at a bigger disadvantage because you were a minority, and could you explain that?
Yeah, sure. There was always been times when I first got to Canada that I always felt like a minority because Canada's a very white place. And so to be in a white space as a man of color or a boy of color growing up, I just knew I was always different because in a class full of 25 or 30 students, I was the only person of color in that class. Right? And that's only because the Canadian migration system is different than the U.S., so that there was a very small number of migrants when I was growing up.
Right.
It's changed now. There's clearly a lot more migrants and immigrant populations in Canada, but back in the 1970s, there was a very few of us. So in dealing with that, I had to deal with stereotypes, name-calling, physical fighting for
Just being who
you are and just being picked on.
Right.
So as a male, I grew up learning how to defend myself. I also learned about microaggressions. I have a word for it now, microaggressions, but I didn't have a word for it back then. Which means that essentially those subtle ways in which people will use language and call you things.
Right.
I can call everything from nigger to packy to queer, all kinds of different things in my growing up experience that were words that were very wounding. So
Right.
those words actually caused me to feel a sense of, I need to defend myself. Because people are questioning my masculinity, my sexuality, my race, my ability to do things.
Right.
Because by them labeling me those things, it meant that they were saying to me indirectly that you are less than, you're the other, you are somebody who can never be successful.
Did you ever think about quitting? And if you did, why?
I think we all think about quitting, and I'll give you a scenario that I don't want to refer to it as this, but I've learned that this is a scenario that goes on for a lot of people of color, and we often refer to it as the imposter syndrome. It's a syndrome where we're in a place of authority or a place of leadership, and we've achieved something. We may have we may have a degree in our hands,
Right.
but we're still in the back of our minds feeling the sense of lower self-esteem than somebody who has the same piece of paper, same credential, that may come from the dominant group. There's a sense that they have a sense of entitlement to it.
Right.
Whereas for me, in growing up, there was always that fear that someone's going to discover me, and you pull the rug under for somebody and they fall. And so that fear of always falling or failing was always part of my growing up experience. So I still think it affects me even today. So my compensation for that is that I'm always super well prepared. Try to
right,
always
right.
be overcompensating. So if someone, for instance, is going to do this much work for the same thing, I'm going to do this much work.
Just to prove you can.
Not only that I can, that they can't, or whoever is going to see me in that place will know that I've gone way beyond what was expected. And so that they can't say, oh, he's failed at that because he only did the minimum, and therefore he's a reflection of his ethnic group, or he's a reflection of his race, or he's a reflection of his inadequacy. We expect that of them, only being able to go this far. That's what goes through my head. Yeah.
What was your biggest obstacle, you would say, your first year in college?
Oh, my first year in college? Learning to read, learning to balance time, learning how to be a serious student rather than just a joker who got by on things that I was able to get by in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Learning how to overcome that imposter syndrome, that coming back to the idea of how I actually got to where I've gotten. In other words, in some respects for me, getting to even into university for the first time, the first year, I even felt that imposter syndrome too, where I said to myself, do I really have enough skill to be here?
Right.
Yeah. So those are different moments in my mind where I would have that feeling that I wasn't necessarily qualified to be there.
Kind of just the doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Doubting all the time. Yeah.
How did you pick your major, and did you switch it?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So when I first got to college, I was a very good historian, meaning in high school, and a very good geographer.
Right.
When I say very good, I meant those are the subjects I liked.
Mhm.
Those are the ones if we had readings to do in history, I would read the whole book. I would go, you have now something called Wikipedia. We
Mhm.
actually had encyclopedias.
Oh, the big
They're
books.
actually a book, yeah.
Yeah.
Pull it off the shelf, and you'd actually look for the definition or whatever it is. I used to love reading those. I used to love just going to the library, for instance, public library, and sitting there and actually just pulling off books and starting learning things. So that curiosity, in my mind, meant that I was going to possibly try out this history thing when I got to university.
Mhm.
And I did. I took American history. I also took world geography when I first got to
Right.
university. Both courses were courses that had huge numbers of students. So I had like 200 students in each class.
Mhm.
And it wasn't the same. In other words, I'd gotten there, I thought it would be a certain thing, and it wasn't that at all. And so for me, within a year of doing that, I then said to myself, well, I don't really want to be a historian or a geographer. I now want to try out sociology, because
Mhm.
that was one of the courses that I also taken as an elective in the first year. So that became my new passion, because it gave me a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of curiosity in an area that raised questions about society and order and power and so forth. And these were questions I was already asking myself anyway, as a young person growing up. Like I was,
Of course.
a young high school student. I'm looking around me too, and I'm curious about why certain things are the way they are. So sociology really gave me a kind of a lens to look at those things through, and that's why after my first year, I actually gravitated towards that,
Oh, okay.
and I stayed there.
All right. So, like, going back, were your parents really supportive of your decision to go to college?
So my parents come from a culture where college was everything. So both parents only went to high school. They finished high school, and they didn't necessarily, in their society that they grew up in, which is Trinidad and the Caribbean, have the resources to go and do a university degree. Because in a small micro society like that, a very, very small percentage of people within those societies actually went on to do college,
Right.
University. So for them, it was never necessarily an option. And when they were growing up also, it was never necessarily a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I say it's a requirement now because if you don't have a university degree of some kind, you have a hard time becoming successful.
Getting a job.
Getting a
all
job.
that kind of stuff.
Back when they were, though, coming out of high school, that was more than adequate in their time to actually get a decent entry-level job. Times have changed, and clearly now a high school degree will typically take you into a service-like job, working, pushing a broom, serving at a restaurant,
Right.
those sort of jobs,
Mhm.
really service-oriented. Back then, though, when my parents were coming through, that wasn't necessarily, you could actually get a kind of a white-collar job, meaning that you could actually work in an office. You'd have enough skills to work in an office environment. And that's what they both did. So coming back to full circle, they, though, once they had started working, both of them actually went back to night school.
Oh, okay.
And they got certificates. They never got degrees, they got certificates. So my
Mhm.
mother got a certificate in accounting, and my father, I think, got a certificate in marketing. So, again, that was enough during their times to actually see a little bit of a creeping up in terms of their opportunity to come in entry level and then creep up a little bit.
Mhm.
But for them, coming back to their culture they came from, it was everybody understood that if you became a degree person and you became a lawyer, a doctor, a pharmacist, an engineer, these were professions that were well recognized in the cultures they came from as being successful,
Right.
degrees. So initially, when I first started school, my mother was really encouraging me to try to become a computer scientist, because back then computers had just emerged, and so she recognized in the industry that she was in that those people in her office who were computer literate and who could, use a computer and that kind of stuff, were clearly better off, and she could see the future would be that. So when I first got to college, she was really encouraging me to do that.
Okay.
It never worked out for me, computer science, but I took it.
Oh, you tried.
Yeah, I just never. Back then, we actually had to do programming.
Oh, okay.
So we'd actually program in something called Fortran, and this is a language that's probably dead by now. And it was very, very math oriented. I was never very great at math, and it was very much into the actual programming by line.
Oh.
Line programming.
Okay.
Right now, all that stuff that you use in computers has been written probably 15 years ago by people. The DNA of those programs are still coming back from my era. You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So they've now been built out. And so when we saw that guy playing that sophisticated game, if you go into the DNA of that game, there were people like me who actually, in my generation, not me, my generation, who actually designed that DNA coding.
Mhm.
And then since then, it's been built out. You
Right.
get faster processing, stuff like that. Yeah.
So, was there any sense of guilt or anything like that when you actually left home?
Sense of guilt for myself. Okay, so my story is that I actually didn't leave home to go to college. So economically, because of the city I grew up in, the university itself was 45 minutes away in terms of by car.
Mm-hmm.
Probably about an hour and a half by bus. I was lucky enough that my parents passed me down their old car. So I actually had a car when I was 17. And so by the time I got to college, I had an old beat up car, but it would get me to college nonetheless.
Right.
The point is that I didn't actually leave home to go to college. So I didn't really have a sense of a guilty feeling that I was actually leaving people, like maybe you both experienced that, which is very different than I had to, because every night I go to the university every day, and then at night I would come home. It was like a job,
Right.
in a sense. So it was a very different experience than you were probably having, because you were probably living in residence.
Mhm.
You're probably doing all those things that trying to negotiate being connected to home still. Well, I was always home, in a sense. Yeah.
Okay.
So that was different.
And then heading there, since you're staying at home, were there any concerns or fears going in there and having to come home and go back to drive the homework?
Well, I think the fears, I don't think there was necessarily fears, but it was definitely a different kind of a culture, because living in a city of 3 million people, that's how big the city was, there was a culture whereby that was very normal. And we called ourselves the commuters to the university. There was a commuter culture. So people would arrive to the university by bus, by car, and then at 6 o'clock in the evening, everybody's gone, in a sense. There were still people living in residence,
Mm-hmm.
but they had a different culture, meaning that they had a residence culture, and it was fine. I actually met, in my first couple of years, I actually met my ex-girlfriend, many exes now, she was actually in residence.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually got to know the residence culture, because through her, I would actually hang around, and so I'd actually
Right.
go to their events and that kind of stuff. So I actually had a moderated situation, because I was actually able to do that with her.
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both, yeah. But normally, had I not met her and that kind of thing wasn't working, I would have only had that I'd go and come back. use the library, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it was different than you guys.
Right. When you went to college, was it just for you, or did you feel like you were doing it more for your whole support system and everybody else?
Well, if I think about that, I think I was probably, at that point in my life, just doing it for me. Only because, as I said, my parents had these jobs that were above entry level by that point. So they were, actually, my father was a supervisor by that point. And my mother was in a government job where she had really decent benefits, and she had decent working conditions, and she had, a situation where, by that point, they were clearly white collar workers. So, by me actually getting an education, it wouldn't have meant anything different to them. I mean, in other words, I would never have to contribute to their, let's say, family success. It was never seen that way. So by that point, and this was now, we'd now been living in Canada now for 25 years by that point, which I actually started university. So.
If you were to give advice to, us or younger people, what would you say?
Just advice to be successful?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of advice?
Yeah.
Okay. So to me, advice around being successful, especially here at the university campus, would be things like being curious, going outside your comfort zone, trying to find for yourself a balance where you can actually be successful at all the aspects of your situation. So your situation as a student is very different than a situation, let's say, somebody who has to work full-time and come to school.
Right.
Your situation is such that your job is actually to be a successful student, if you want to think about it in the bigger picture. So to be a successful student, one has to learn skills of reading, writing, critical thinking, presentation skills, skills that involve interpersonal skills, how to get along with people.
Right.
And here at university, then, those opportunities are there, but it's you have to take the initiative to actually collect those in. Let's say you have a knapsack. You got to collect those in your knapsack as you go along. It's not all going to happen the first year.
Right.
It's going to happen over a process of 4 years. And in those 4 years, if you can get your knapsack really heavy like this sucker is, full of those skills, because you've intentionally gone out there and tried to fill up your knapsack with them, then that to me is the kinds of advice I would suggest for you to understand. So right now your knapsack is pretty light, right? You're just kind of throwing it around, you kind of find out how to put things in there. Well, try to figure out ways through which you can actually intentionally go after some of these skills. So take hard classes. Take situations that you normally wouldn't have participated in and done. Try them out. Expand your imagination about what you can do and can't do. Right? So don't only think, I can only do this.
Only see so much.
Sorry?
Yeah, when you do that, you can only see so much.
Yeah, you can only see so much. And you actually have a limited experience here at a place where there are endless possibilities of occupation. So think about all the people that are around you right now. So let's say there's 28,000 students around you, right? Of those 28,000, each one of those 28,000 is gonna have a unique experience here, and it's gonna be dependent upon what Carl wants to do, right? So if Carl wants to be the guy who gets involved, I'm just gonna put these out there, with some kind of club sport, and he wants to get involved with some sort of group that's going to eventually do study abroad, and he wants to get involved with doing something with regards to community activity. He wants to get involved in his major.
Right.
All those are possible. But Carl's got to figure out how to, be in with a balance so he can do all those things. So it involves really thinking it through and intentionally figuring out for Carl what you can do and can't do. Yeah.
As a professor, are there any tips or things that you think would make it easier to come see a professor or ask questions during class or come visit during office hours?
Yeah. Some of the tips are actually go. I'll tell you right now. Like today, I had an office hour. No one showed up. Had an office hour Monday. No one showed up. So what I'm getting at is we're there. I'm there. I'm actually sitting there in my office. And it may seem easy right now in terms of school. Right. When I say easy, you only did your first 2 chapters, right? So they were pretty clear. What would I have to go and see the professor about? This is all pretty straightforward to me. I'll just read it and I'll regurgitate it on the test. Well, there's beyond that. There's developing relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Such that, for example, Carl decides later on in this year that he wants to go and study abroad.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's great, but then Carl needs a letter of recommendation from professors that are actually on this campus to say, I know Carl. Carl seems like a very, again, balanced kind of guy. He has a certain personality, he's outgoing, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
I could put that in a letter and actually write it if Carl had come during those times when it seems like there's nothing really to do. And he came just to make a connection with me.
Right.
Right? And talked about a concept that I discussed in the lecture. So I discussed the concept of, Oedipus complex in psychology, right? So I discussed Oedipus, or I discussed the id, ego, and superego. Okay?
Right.
Okay? So I discussed that. Carl shows up in my office and says, hey, you know what, I kind of understand the concept. Can you just give me a little bit more on how can we apply that to today?
Mm-hmm.
That then gives me the opportunity to talk to Carl about that theory, which I talked about. But it also gives Carl an opportunity to make a connection with me. And so the next time I see Carl, because now he actually sits down near the front,
Mm-hmm.
right? He sits right in front of me, the lecture's going on, and he's actually sitting there. I have a friendly face to actually look at.
Right.
Believe me, we're actually afraid when we're standing up in front of 200 students, lecturing. Believe it or not, some of us may not look like we're afraid, but we're coming back to that whole idea. Remember I said you're always worried about falling?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm worried about stumbling. I'm worried about not having the right things to say. I'm worried about, looking like I'm a professional. Every professor goes through this. So by having people within their class who they become acquaintances with, not friends, but acquaintances,
Right.
then that makes it a lot easier when you want something from me.
Mm-hmm.
Letters of recommendation, advice, doing research with me, those all become much easier for me to entertain those if I've seen Carl before. And I've seen Carl all the way through. Right? So I'm just putting that, I'm not blaming you, but I'm saying to you that's probably something that you may have done once already, because that was one of the things that we encourage students to do.
Right.
But continue to build a relationship. Don't think that I've just built a relationship by once. It's got to be over time. Consistency. And then take another course with me. In other words, hey, I like the way that Professor Plaza actually teaches. I'm going to look up what he's teaching two terms from now, and I'm going to try and be in that class because I kind of like the way his thought was.
Mm-hmm. And so, is there anything like you could emphasize in terms of networking and making your circle expand?
Yeah, well, to me, as young people like yourselves, I don't think you necessarily have to worry about the networking part yet. You're only in your first year. I mean,
Right.
Probably when you're to be like your second or third year to be thinking about networking in the context of doing internships,
Mm-hmm.
and because if you're networking around the students, really, I mean, there's not much that a fellow student can actually do for you in terms of a network. Focus more now on, in my opinion, the grades, finding a balance, feeling a sense of belonging here. Like,
Mm-hmm.
let's find a niche of people that you actually connect with, and figure out ways to be successful in your first year. As you get in your second and third year, then you can start thinking about, oh boy, I'm going to be graduating in 2 years or a year and a half or so. Now I need to really start working on this networking stuff that will really help me out in terms of landing a job and doing things that are also important to me.
Right.
But focus on the other stuff for now.
Mm-hmm. All right, did you have any other questions?
No.
All right, well, that's it.
All right, thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Good, I'm glad we were able to do this.